Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The 2023 International Bank of Korea International Conference will begin shortly. Good morning. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2023 Bank of Korea International Conference. My name is Hae Sun-ju from the International Relations team of the Bank of Korea, and I'm going to be your Master of Ceremony. After COVID-19, we are proud to host this conference face-to-face for the first time in 4 years since 2019. And it is an even greater honor to meet you all in person at the Bank of Korea Conference Hall. Professor Thomas Sargent, the Nobel laureate in economics, contributed as an organizer for this year's conference, as it has always been doing since 2007. Please give a round of applause to Professor Sargent for his great efforts to this wonderful conference. This year's conference will address various issues related to the policy challenges after the pandemic, including rebalancing and growth, the soft landing and deleveraging, global fragmentation and digitalization, and CBDC. Now, it is time to commence the opening session. The opening session consists of keynote speech by Professor Narayana KOCHERLAKOTA and policy dialogue featuring Governor Chang, Professor Thomas Sargent, and Professor Narayana KOCHERLAKOTA. Prior to starting keynote speech, I would like to give a brief introduction about Professor Narayana KOCHERLAKOTA. He is a professor of economics at the University of Rochester and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has published over 60 contributions in various fields of economics and is currently focusing on monetary and fiscal policy. He served as the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis from 2009 to 2015. And was named one of the top 12 global thinkers for 2012 by Foreign Policy magazine. So, without further ado, let me invite Professor Narayana KOCHERLAKOTA. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's a huge honor to be here and be here in this beautiful facility. Very proud to have this honor of opening up this great conference. I think we're going to learn a lot over the next day and a half. I have to say I didn't recognize the picture that they showed with my name under it. It's a much younger man, but you've got the old version here, so hopefully you'll be able to make do with that. All right, so my talk is going to be about 2 questions. And the first question is I think one that we're all interested in, and it's going to come to these questions from the U.S. perspective. Why was this? We had this spike in U.S. inflation that began in 2021, and has stayed with us now into 2023. And the second question is going to be about what policy tools should we be thinking about using to bring inflation back down to desirable levels. The first question, you'll see that the Master of Ceremonies made reference to the fact that I was a member of the Federal Open Market Committee. I was part of the Federal Reserve policymaking team on monetary policy for 6 years. And my approach to the first question is going to be very much that of a policymaker, I would say. And the second question, it'll be more of an academic approach, and it'll be built on a recent paper that I published in the Journal of Monetary Economics. I should say that I'm really looking forward to the policy conversation, the dialogue that I'm going to be able to have with Governor RHEE and Professor Sargent after my talk. I think that'll be much more informative than what I'm going to say to open things off, but that's we have to await that pleasure. Okay. So, questions, and here are the answers that I'm going to provide at least. So, my answer to the first question is somewhat surprising. it really does not seem that overly easy monetary and/or fiscal policy are responsible for the recent run-up in U.S. inflation. And I think this comes as a surprise to many who see, oh, there was a lot of stimulus. There's a lot, monetary policy was very easy, and we'll talk about in what sense it was. But nonetheless, when you look at the data, it does not seem like this has been the big driver for inflation. Rather, inflation seems to be due to the fact that firms are enjoying much more market power than they did in 2019, right before COVID. The second question is what policy tools should be used to bring inflation back down to desirable levels. This is the part that is going to build on this recent work that I talked about that I published last year. And here I'm going to suggest that the inflation fight would actually be more ensured of success if it relied more on restrictive fiscal policy as opposed to restrictive monetary policy. So let me turn then to my first question, which is this question of why have we seen this inflation spike? So I'm going to bore you by going over what we're talking about when I'm talking about the inflation spike. And so this is a picture of what's happening with personal consumption expenditure inflation, and in particular in core inflation. So as you know, when I talk about core, I'm talking about stripping out food prices and energy prices. This is so that the Federal Reserve's target of 2%, which I've marked on this picture, is framed in terms of PC inflation. That tends to run a little bit lower than CPI inflation systematically, and during this period has been much lower at some points in time. So it's important to be thinking about PCE inflation as opposed to CPI inflation when you're thinking about what the Fed's success or lack thereof on keeping inflation under control. And on core, again, as you know, core inflation is thought by many policymakers to have more informational content about what inflation is going to be doing in the future. The idea there is that, especially with oil prices, you might see a big run-up, and that's going to reverse itself very quickly, so it doesn't really tell you much of what's the future track of inflation. So the blue line tells us where inflation is the actual track of PC and core inflation. The red line is the Fed's target. All these pictures are going to start in 2019 quarter 4, except for one, which I'll highlight later. And, well, we have that very brief recession the NBR marked out for us in 2020 that's related to COVID, of course. And beginning in 2021, we see inflation pop above the Fed's target and has risen up to over 5% and now is coming, depending on everything in the U.S. is framed through the political polarization. You'll hear some people say, hey, inflation's coming down, and others say, not so much. And that is, I think the picture, the line sort of, the trend downwards is consistent with both perspectives. But we have seen, we're still very far from 2%, though. I think everyone can agree on that. That number at the very end, in case you can't see it, is something on the order of 4.7%. So where did this come from? And I think many onlookers have pointed to fiscal monetary policy. So in fiscal policy, we had large government transfers in 2020 and early 2021. In April of 2020, in the response to immediate response to COVID, then again in December of 2020, as President Trump was leaving office, and then in early 21, as President Biden entered office, we had 3 rounds of large increases in transfers. Easy monetary policy, the Fed kept interest rates near zero until March of 22, and this is when inflation was actually close to, if not above 5%, so they waited a long time, in inflation space at least, to begin to raise rates. So it looks like both of these were very easy, and then the question is, to what extent is the high inflation due to large excess demand, aggregate excess demand? So I'm going to try to address this question through the lens of a particular accounting relationship that not an accounting relationship, but a first order condition, really, that emerges out of many macro models. It traces itself back to Professor Tak-Yeon's dissertation in Chicago, really. It's what we sometimes call the new Keynesian Phillips curve. I have one replacement that I'll highlight as I move along. It's not quite the new Keynesian Phillips curve what I'm going to be looking at. But basically, look, many of you here are probably skeptical about this model. I've encountered that skepticism throughout my life. I myself have some skepticism about this model. But what it forces you to do, and what is good about this model, is it makes you think about what firms are thinking about when they set their prices. That's the critical thing in this model, what's really nice about it. It's not, I don't know what if I hit a button. Okay. I'm not sure if it makes you think about what the firms are doing when they are thinking about when they set their prices. So on the left-hand side, we have inflation. On the right-hand side, the first term is a measure of real marginal cost, because it's telling you about how much wages are going up for the firms, net of productivity. All this is measured in net of deviations from steady state. And then the inflation, the second term on the right-hand side is expected inflation. Firms who are setting their prices, worried that they might have to keep them in place for even a little bit of time, are going to be thinking about where's inflation going to be going in the future, where are my competitors going to go in the future when I'm not changing my price. And then epsilon is other things, and we'll come back to those other things later. I'm going to roll this equation forwards. This is where I'm taking it a little more seriously maybe than I should, but inflation today is going to be some discounted sum of marginal costs in the future. That's the first term. Expected inflation in the future, and then there's these other terms. Now I'm going to try to obtain some crude measures of the right-hand side from that same period of 2019 to 2023. And so real marginal cost, you can see what's going on. If you look at in the COVID period, in the recession, wages went up a lot relative to productivity. Real wages went up a lot relative to productivity, and you see that in the fact that real marginal costs are very high. But now, if we move forward to 2023, actually real marginal costs are low. Wages are not high. Real wages are not high relative to productivity. It does not look like firms are facing a lot of cost pressures, is another way to say that, when you measure it in this context. Now, what about the, so all this is percentage deviations. At the end, we're at something like minus 1%. So now, inflation expectations have moved the right direction, but it's very important to keep an eye on what the axis is here. So this is five-year forward inflation expectations. It's basically where financial market investors are betting inflation is going to be from a period 5 to 10 years from now. And what you see is inflation expectations have moved up since 2019 quarter 4, but they've moved up by only a 0.5 percentage point. And in fact, if I went back to 2018 quarter 4, which I've chosen not to do, this picture would not have any change in it at all. Basically, we're at the same level in terms of inflation expectations as we were 5 years ago. So we do see some run-up in inflation expectations, but not a lot. So this is the summary of where I'm trying to say here is the right-hand side has moved up a lot, 3.1 percentage points. The left-hand side has gone up by 3.1 percentage points. The right-hand side, the first two terms have not gone up enough to begin to account for what's going on the left-hand side. So costs have not moved up enough, and where inflation is expected to go has not moved up very much. So why am I focusing on these first two terms? Because that is where excess demand is supposed to show up in our thinking. That's where excess demand shows up in terms of where firms set prices in terms of their costs, because you have to hire so many workers to build all the demand for all the goods and services that are demanded by their customers, or they are worried about inflation expectations gone up. The U.S. has issued all this public debt. Deficits are very high. Actually, they're not, but deficits were very high for some period in this time frame. And you might think that that would lead them to have higher inflation expectations, and that would lead them to be charging higher prices. But this is not going on in the data. That's why I say that it does not look like excess demand is the driver here, because the places where it should show up in the firm problem, you don't see it. All right, so let me talk quickly about a couple of robustness checks. I focused on labor as a source of cost. There's a lot of talk about non-labor inputs. Olivier Blanchard and Ben Bernanke have a recent Brookings paper that came out where they emphasize what they call price shocks, which is supposed to be shocks to costs that are not coming from labor. I think it's a very tricky argument, though, because it tends to ignore the substitutability between labor and these other inputs. So costs go up in things you import. Maybe households don't buy as many of those goods and services that are being produced with those imported inputs, but they'll substitute that to other things. And you should see then the cost for labor going up. Okay? And we can measure the real marginal cost using labor. We can still measure real marginal cost in isolation using this formula, but you don't worry about the math. The basic idea is simply that if other inputs are going up in price, that has to show up in the price of labor if that's what's going on, because firms are going to bid up that labor instead of using those expensive inputs. And again, I'm going to go through this too fast, but again, you don't see this in the data. So this is a correction to my earlier model, which allows for a imperfect non-Cobb-Douglas production function. So sigma here is less than 1. That means it's CES. It's less than perfect substitutes with these other inputs. And you actually get even lower real marginal costs than we had before. And that's because of the fact that another way to say this is, if the fact that other inputs are really becoming expensive is what's driving the inflation, it should show up in the fact that productivity for labor is very low relative to what you're paying for the workers. Again, you just don't see that in the data. This is abstracting from labor augmenting technological change. I won't go through that here. And the other thing you might worry about is, this is a point that has been made many times in the RBC literature, that observed wages are not the right thing to look at in terms of figuring out the incremental cost of increasing labor input. We could instead look at the marginal rate of substitution between labor and consumption for a typical worker. Now, I'm going to do something terrible here. I'm just going to use a representative agent. I'm not going to try to look at heterogeneity. Professor Chang sitting here, he's taught us that we should not be doing this, but I'm going to ignore the lessons of his work and instead I'll look only at the representative agent's marginal rate of substitution. And again, I think this, it's not perfect, but it captures something of what's going on. And it does, this point is an important one. I think, for example, if you look in 2020, what's happening in 2020 in the COVID recession is consumption is really low and hours are really low. So this representative agent is desperate to work. And you don't see that in the real wage data. You see it in the shadow real wage data. So I think there is something to be said for looking at this kind of shadow real wage picture. But you fast forward to 2023, and there's just no difference between these things. There's some slight difference, but there's not much to build on there. So it's still true that even if you looked at what's going on in terms of representative agents' willingness to work, the wage they would demand to work more hours, you don't see much going on there. Okay, so this is all very negative. I'm basically telling you what doesn't work. And so I come to you bearing a shock term, an error term, and telling you that's what's driving everything. And the red term seems to have risen by a lot. So what is that red term? And it's typically attributed in the literature to being due to higher markups. Okay? That is that firms now seem to face less negative residual demand elasticities than was true in 2019 quarter 4. I have not used this word, this new word that's emerged in the United States in the last 2 or 3 years of greedflation. I don't like that word, and I'm not using it. But this is basically saying that there's higher markups here for firms. Where do these higher markups come from? And that's the weakness of this. That's the weakness of relying on an error term. Yeah, there is some evidence. If you look at corporate profit rates, I wouldn't want to build a case on this alone. There's some slight evidence. This is a longer-term picture. This goes back to the early part of the century, and only the end is about 2019 quarter four thereafter. And we do see some increase, even relative to trend. There's a steep trend in this number, but there's some sign here of higher profits for corporations. There's no real agreed upon explanation of why markups have risen so sharply in the past 3 years. Our theories of endogenous markups remain, I think, I'm very excited about the work that's going on, but they remain in their infancy. And so my own tentative explanation for this is that I think that businesses experimented with higher markups during COVID. There was true scarcities of number of goods and services, and so at that point, firms tried out, let me try charging higher prices, let's see if consumers will bear those, as businesses are fond of saying. And they learned from that, and we always model businesses knowing exactly what their demand elasticities are, and the truth of the matter is they really don't at all, especially those are moving targets. There's a lot of experimentation that goes on in trying to figure out how much can I charge consumers without them bulking and moving on to something else instead. And they've learned they can charge a lot. The other side of this coin is on entry. And I think that's the part that's most puzzling to an economist is if there's so much increase in profits, we should see entry that will erode those profits. And why aren't we seeing that? And there, again, I don't have such great explanations. I think there are, you look at the pandemic, the kind of durable risk it represented. I think in a lot of ways, it's a horrible thing in terms of the huge number of people who died around the world. The economic consequences have been large as well. But all that said, I think we were lucky. The tails of the event were much worse than what actually transpired. So the risks are very high, I think, if you look at that, the new risks relative to what we're thinking about in 2019 quarter four are much higher. And I think those are, and I'm not even mentioning the war risk that I think is revealed itself through Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's something I think most people did not have on their radar screen as being important in 2019 quarter four. But these are very tentative explanations. I don't have the kind of hardcore systematic analysis that would tell us why markups have risen. All I can tell you is that the traditional guilty parties, the butler, as we would say in murder mystery, of fiscal monetary policy don't seem to be responsible here. All right, let me switch gears completely. So that's the end of my first part of my talk about what is accounting for the inflation spike. I'm now going to talk about trying to lower inflation. So this is built on work that I published recently in the Journal of Monetary Economics. It's an analytical heterogeneous agent New Keynesian model. So you put together two pieces here. So one is, on the one side, you'll have a Bewley kind of model of incomplete insurance on the household side, something that all of us have had the opportunity of reading and studying and learning from Lundquist and Sargent. That's a model you can really learn a lot about from reading Tom's text. But then the other side, it has this inflation determination restriction, New Keynesian Phillips curve, that is also stuck in there. That's on the firm side of the problem. That looks the same, basically, as what I showed you earlier. So you have heterogeneity in the household side, but not on the firm side, really. What is new in my paper is that public debt is bubbly. So in a Bewley model of the kind that Lundquist and Sargent talk about, where households are facing uninsurable risks, they can have such high precautionary demand for government assets that it drives the real interest rate on those government assets below the growth rate in the economy. And that happens it's very easy, it happens very naturally. And then you have a situation where the government can self-finance itself. It never has to raise any taxes at all. It can just finance itself by issuing new debt. Just keep rolling over the debt. Now you have to do, this relies critically on heterogeneity. You can't get bubble equilibrium in representative agent models. You need to have heterogeneity in the model for this to be true. You need precautionary savings and demand to be driving the interest rate. So why am I choosing R less than G? It's because, arguably at least, for the past 20 years, this is what's been true in US data. Olivier Blanchard has a great presidential address in the American Economic Review where he argues it's been true for much longer than this. But I'm just focusing on TIPS, in the inflation indexed securities of the Treasury issues. And R's, I think, been less than G over the last 20 years. I've drawn a different growth rate pre and post the Great Recession. So this data goes from about 2003 through 2023. And you'll see the Great Recession is the long gray shaded area, and then the thin gray shaded area is the COVID recession. G is much lower now, I think, than we thought before the Great Recession, but it's still true. R is less than G. And even though R has gone up quite a bit in the last 2 years, it's still true that R remains less than, I think, most reasonable forecasts of growth rates. So we can use this bubbly Hank model to go after the question that we've got a shock to the epsilon term in the inflation determination restriction, wherever that comes from. But you can call it markups. It doesn't really matter where it comes from in the context of the model. And how can the government offset this shock? And the key to this analysis is that agents are experiencing idiosyncratic uninsured shocks over their lifetimes. So any given agent, at some time in the future, they're going to be borrowing constrained, and at sometimes they're not going to be. They're going to be unconstrained. This is why you can get a bubble in this model, and you can't get it in the representative agent model, is because you don't. Representative agent model, the agent's never borrowing constrained. Here, occasionally, the agent has to be borrowing. The agents are always borrowing constrained, and that's because other people are holding all the government assets at that stage. Okay, so in this model, monetary policy alone may not work. Now, the usual policy approach here to lowering inflation, and the one we're seeing, I guess, followed by the Federal Reserve right now, is to raise nominal interest rates temporarily above where you expect them to be in the steady state. And the immediate effect of this interest rate increase is exactly what you would expect in the typical model, which is the spending falls. Here, the spending, though, is of the spending of the unconstrained agents. They're the ones who care about the interest rate in thinking about how much should I spend today, looking forward. The interest rate's high, they think, oh, I'll save more and spend less. And so, the fall in their spending means that costs fall for firms and inflation falls. But you get this weird effect, weird, it's my own model, but this unusual effect where a higher R today stimulates more spending in future periods. Now, why would this be true? It's because when you have more higher interest rates, that generates more interest income from government bonds, and that leads some agents, the constrained agents, to spend more. The unconstrained agents don't care about this because they're unconstrained. They don't care about having a little bit of extra income. That doesn't matter to them. But the constrained agents do care a lot. Now, is this a big effect or a small effect? Well, it depends. If the public debt is big enough, then this ladder dynamic stimulus effect can become so large that monetary policy fails to work. What does it mean to fail to work? Well, you've raised rates to try to drag down spending, but next period spending has gone up. What do? Well, I guess we'll raise rates. Well, that has the problem. In the next period, you're actually created more extra spending. This actually, when the public debt is big enough, this just blows up on you. And so interest rates hikes by themselves do not work to bring down inflation. Fiscal policy, by way of contrast, alone does work. Now, the government, suppose the government cuts transfers, raises taxes, while leaving nominal interest rates unchanged. There's no recurring in this model, this heterogeneous agent model, there's well, the R less than G model, I should say more carefully, there's no Ricardian need for offsetting transfers or tax cuts. If you cut transfers today, people don't think, well, that's great. I'm losing transfers today, but that means I'm going to pay less taxes in the future. There's nothing like that in this model, because you never raise taxes to pay off government debt. You always just roll over the debt. And so, because R is less than G. So the immediate effect of restrictive fiscal policy here is unambiguous. If you cut transfers, people don't see, oh, I've got like a few lower taxes in the future coming down the road. Instead, there's less private spending going on by the constraint agents now, and lower inflation in the current period. The dynamic effect goes the right way for you now. You're trying to rein in inflation. The dynamic effect of cutting spending is also negative. Having lower transfers means there's less government debt, there's less ability for people to hedge themselves against these idiosyncratic shocks that are affecting them. And so there's going to be less private spending and, again, less inflation. So monetary policy didn't work because it had this, potentially had this, I should say more carefully, there's a potential for monetary policy not to work, whereas fiscal policy will definitely work in this structure. You know, the debate about the debt ceiling, we're seeing a small move in the U.S. towards more restrictive fiscal policy. I'm not going to argue for a second that we're doing enough in that dimension to bring down inflation back down to 2%. But and I don't think that's actually the motivation behind the discussions right now in Washington. So let me wrap up. So it's a common thesis is that inflation spike is due to an increase in aggregate demand fueled by easy monetary and easy fiscal policy. You'll hear from Keynesian economists. You'll hear from avowedly non-Keynesian economists that this is the source of the problem. But digging into the data, this does not seem to be what's going on. It does not seem that firms are facing higher costs or higher expected inflation. Instead, they seem to be able to be charging higher markups. How should the government stabilize inflation in the face of the shock? If you really think of public debt being very large, as appears to be true right now, we should be using fiscal policy because that's a more reliable tool and not monetary policy. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Narayana KOCHERLAKOTA, for your insightful keynote speech. We'll move on to the policy dialogue right after our staff is finished setting up. Professor KOCHERLAKOTA, please wait a moment on the stage.
I'm not going to run away.
Okay. Yeah. Now we will begin the policy dialogue. Governor Yee will lead this policy dialogue. I will hand over the microphone to Governor Yee.
Okay. Thank you. It's my great honor to be a moderator of this policy dialogue. Thanks for the excellent presentation. As our master of ceremony introduced our speakers and our guests, I do not want to repeat it. I just jumped to the some of our dialogues from here. As for the first part of your presentation, regarding the conclusion that it is more like a markup and profit increase rather than the aggregate demand and loose monetary and fiscal policy that drive the inflation. As a person from a saltwater school, probably we have a lot of reservation and questions on that. And I think the graph that it shows, the increase of margin, looks like it started a little bit before the COVID start. And then also you estimate that markup increase up to like a 60% seems to be a little bit too high. So if one interpret that the increase of margins, markups, and profit was possible because of the low interest environment and also enormous fiscal subsidy, which actually give the subsidy for the wage subsidy and in some sense protect the firm to face the bankruptcy. So in that sense, the loose fiscal policy especially can be a cause of this rise of the margin. If someone argued that way, what will be your response?
Well, I would say that's a great point. I think the challenge here is we just don't know as much about the determination of markups as we'd like to. I'm going to say I'm sympathetic to that line of argument, but the challenge for the excess demand story is that we've talked about excess demand for years in macro, and we know how it operates. It operates through the margins that I described in my model. Now we have to come up with a new story for excess demand where it's operating more through markups than through the cost channel. With all that said, you're a policymaker. I was a policymaker once. The whole game of being a policymaker is keeping your mind open to all number of alternatives. And I do think that it is quite possible that the learning about firm demand, the learning about elasticities that I talked about was facilitated by the fiscal stimulus. But we get now to where we are in 2023, where the interest rates are where they are, and where fiscal policy actually has been in retrenchment in the United States over the past year. Now markups are where they are because firms have learned, based on whatever cause, they've learned that they're able to charge these higher prices. So I'm sympathetic that the learning was facilitated about residual demand elasticities was facilitated by fiscal policy and monetary policy. But now the way that's carried on going forward, I think, has been through an unusual channel, which is this higher market power.
Okay, I think in some sense I agree with you that the labor market behavior during this period is extraordinary, and we don't have any good answer for that. So, and supply factor seems to play much more role in the run-up of inflation this time. But in that regard, Professor Sargent, I think I still have your book, Conquest of American Inflation, published in 1999. Actually, this is a great book that I learned a lot of macroeconomics and rational expectation at the time. And but this book actually handles the inflation in 1980s, early 90s. So if you have to rewrite this book again based on these new changes in labor market and the Phillips curve debate, the flattening, non-linearity of the Phillips curve, Beveridge curve, all these things, what will be the new chapter in your book?
So I don't know. So let me not answer that question. But let me pretend to.
Okay.
Okay. So that book is kind of it's a Korean product. What I mean by that is my teacher got me interested in this topic is In-Koo Cho. I think he's from Korea originally, and I'll tell you how he got started. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool. Look, I started out not knowing being in an old-style ISLM Keynesian macro, was doing everything static, and then when I was a kid, like 30 years old, the rug got pulled out from under me, and Lucas and Prescott wrote a few papers, and they completely rendered obsolete everything I knew. Prescott told me that by throwing my notes in a garbage can. Okay, so I got the message. So then I became like a religious convert. I became a rational expectations guy. Rational expectations, which is a form of communism. There's one model, everybody knows it, everybody in the model. Okay, so then I got completely believe it. And then I met this Korean, South Korean, In-Koo Cho, and he started getting me interested because Ariel Rubinson was working on models in which there was artificial intelligence. There wasn't rational expectations. There was learning. Okay, and that wasn't in rational expectations models. And my friends told me don't go there. It's like, okay, so but In-Koo hooked me. Okay, and then actually we wrote an early paper on artificial intelligence in the Handbook of Computational, and it was about. We didn't crack the problem, but it's still not cracked, and it's a problem that you guys face because of policymakers. It was about how do you learn to acquire a good reputation. The reason that's a hard problem is if you look at kind of like a Brew-Pearson-Sticchetti models of reputation, you don't learn it, you have it. They're equilibrium concepts where you have it. There's a rational expectation. So In-Koo started. Then guess what? I started thinking about this 80s, like this, and it's relevant for. I'm going on too long. It's relevant for part of Narayana's paper. Rational expectations models do not work so well in explaining the Volcker deflation. And there's some smart guys, King and Goodfriend, who are experts in rational expectations, and they gave up. They wrote some beautiful papers ones in the JME about the Volcker deflation, and they write a model. It's very much in your spirit, but it's different. And what they give up on something that he didn't give up on. This guy's still a true believer. Like he never met In-Koo. Okay, so and a true believer in the following sense, like he took a different path than Goodfriend and King because he accepted that he was taking those market expectations data of inflation very seriously, and it was a big piece of his story. King and Goodfriend gave up on that, and they built a kind of non-rational expectations. King's still working on this, so that's a really hard problem. Okay, so what about this book? That book is me thinking hard about In-Koo's problem, and then in the following way: what happens if couple things. Couple wrinkles is the model, the model that is in the monetary policy makers' heads is wrong. And God's model is something else. And God's generating the data, and the policymakers using his model to make policy. And the data's kicking along. And then finally you add Chris Sims to the mix. And what does that do? Is that Chris Sims in the mix is, well, maybe you should re-estimate your parameters with your wrong model. You take your wrong model, you re-estimate your parameter, and you keep refitting it. Maybe somebody brings you some new shocks, okay? But you refit it. And then you kind of ask, where does that dynamic system go? Well, so that's a parable. And I had a particular true model there that was God's model. If I was going to rewrite this, I might change God's model. Okay, but then I might change, but the kind of the parable, I think the parable is, the thing that's generating the data is our models are always approximations, and this is kind of confronting that and asking if you get some interesting dynamics from that. And the dynamics in there, Inku taught me all this. I still don't understand it. It's NYU dynamics. It's large deviations dynamics, and some interesting things that can happen. The dynamics of least squares learning kind of tends toward approximating the true, but every once in a while, there's big deviations from it. And those deviations are these temporary conquests of inflation. But anyway, so I think I wouldn't touch the book again.
Okay. That was not an answer that I expected, but as you know that Professor Inku Cho is here, and he is a renowned and very respected Korean economist.
I want to say that I do know Inku.
Yeah.
And I was, in fact, Inku's RA.
Yeah, that's what I want to say.
To Chicago. But I have to say that I'm just not as good a student as some.
But anyway, for the audience, don't be disappointed if you do not understand fully Professor Nobel laureate Sargent's remark. I'm now realizing when I first heard his lecture, I understand only 30–40%, but when I repeat it, I can learn a lot. Likewise, today I just understand half of what he is saying, but I will rewind the video and then try to catch up.
So a second. I don't even understand half of what I say. So.
Okay. Typical Chicago Rochester connection. Anyway, so let me go to the second part of your lecture. You said that R minus G is a condition that fiscal rather than monetary policy can be more effective. That's true in some sense academically, but as a policymaker from an emerging market perspective, is R minus G condition can be endogenous, right, rather than exogenous. So, for example, if the country start to rely too massively on the fiscal expansion, and then we are worrying about there may be some kind of moment that R minus G just spike and change into positive and cause a lot of debt crisis, whatever. Especially for the emerging market who do not have a luxury of having an internationalized or the reserve currency. And so what do you think? Given though the currently R minus G is negative, should we rely more on the fiscal policy? And if we face another secular stagnation environment, and that risk is quite particularly high, a country like Korea, Thailand, China, because of our aging problem. So should we if we face that secular stagnation risk, should we rely more on fiscal policy or not?
Yeah. So I think, again, these are great questions, and I will say I haven't thought them through to the extent they deserve. But the starting point for my paper was a theory of the second best. So you take as given that in steady state R is less than G, and then the question is, for a small shock, what should you do in response to that small shock? So it's very much a new Keynesian, in the flavor of the new Keynesian analysis. You're raising, I think, a host of really important questions about moving away from the theory of the second best to thinking about the broader question of, okay, we've got R less than G. Should that mean should the government be borrowing to finance new projects because it's got this great interest rate available to it? But then that could lead to fiscal crises of various kinds. These are things that I haven't taken into account fully in my analysis at all. I will say I have another paper on the possibility of stochastic interest rates, which is the issue you're raising, that sometimes R can be bigger than G. And the one thing I'll say about that case, and what comes out of this analysis that I've done this other paper, is that it's the low R minus G case that wins. That when R minus G is negative, it's essentially, think in a crude way, you should be thinking about taking present values. When R is less than G, present values are infinite. When R is bigger than G, it's finite. Infinity wins. And so the R less than G case is really the dominant case whenever you start to think about the possibility of stochastic interest rates. But look, I think R less than G is an opportunity for governments to do a lot better on a bunch of different policies. And I'm saying, let's take it's given there's quote unquote screwing up on that side. and just think about this one shock and how they respond to it.
I think I was in Tokyo yesterday for the Bank of Japan's international conference, and this issue whether the economy will go back to RHEE negative again, that was one of the key topics that Modi raised. And several Japanese economists say that since the main cause of the low growth and low inflation in Japan was mostly due to structural factors such as aging and other things, they wonder what kind of option they will have if the Japan's inflation currently above 3%, but can go back to below 1%, 0, what kind of options they have, whether they have to rely more on fiscal policy, given despite their debt over GDP ratio is well over 250. And some of them say that given that the nature of the cause was more structural, why shouldn't we focus more on the structural policy rather than fiscal and monetary policy in coping with this problem? So what do you think?
I think that RLS&G does introduce a lot of these questions of, there's a long-term problem facing the economy. If you've got a long-term situation of RLS&G, problem is the wrong word. It's an opportunity. It's a long-term opportunity for the government, whether you're in Japan, the United States, or in South Korea. And I think we should all be thinking about ways to respond to that long-term opportunity. On the other hand, my paper and what I talked about today, not to keep coming back to that, but that is talking about just a small, it's saying we're not dealing with that properly, that long-term property, and now what do we do in the short run? But this question you raise of, that others were talking about at the Bank of Japan conference is a huge question of whereas it seemed like R star in the central banking language is very low in 2019 quarter 4. Will we return to a situation where R star is as low as that? I will say, even if R star goes up some, we have a lot of room, at least in the US context, before it crosses G.
I think this question that I ask you is more about the emerging market. But Professor Sargent, I think I was one of the audience when you give inaugural Richard Good lecture at IMF in 2015, and which discussed the history of the US debt limit. And I know that your course and you, Professor Hall, has also discussing this issue in the panel today, in the session today. In Korea, we are currently debating whether we need to introduce a legal framework for fiscal rules. So based on your lecture and today's paper and your experience, could you please share your thought on the effectiveness of introducing fiscal rules? And if you want to make it successful, what kind of conditions, what kind of consideration we have to place weight?
It's a great question. So again, I'm the wrong guy. I'm the last guy to give advice. And,
come on, you have a lecture.
My wife would tell you that. So I'll just tell you some opinions. So in terms of fiscal rules, I'm thinking is when you have a Congress do it, a legislature, you want to decide whether you want to figure are they making useful rules about economics or are they making a comedy show? And what I mean by comedy show is if you look at the way the debt limit is cast in the United States and show it to a freshman in economics or a high school kid who knows a little accounting, they'll think you're joking. They think you're making a trick question. What do I mean by that? If you look at the way the debt limit is cast, it's measured in a way you wouldn't believe it. It's measured. It ignores all the coupons. It's not mark to market, and it's written in a way that's easily manipulable. And you kind of ask why. If you kind of ask why did they do that, I actually asked Treasury officials, and they tell me they'll get back to me, and then and then it turns out they say I don't know, but there's somebody in the OMB that knows, and then I actually find this person. It's one poor woman who works in some office, and she does it because she was told to. And if you kind of go back and drill why they did it, it's because it's the way they think Alexander Hamilton said to do it. And it's completely crazy and it's misleading. So that's what I mean by comedy show. And that's the number that the U.S. Congress is debating about. So that's silly. And it's also, if you brought a lawyer in, they'd say it's silly, because it's a conflict of laws. It's a law that's in conflict with other laws. So it's great for lawyers. Okay, so it creates business. And maybe this is why those markups. So, but anyway, so if you kind of ask why those rules are, so, and your question about, it's a serious thing. So if you look, there's this old war between evolutionists and designers. It's between Hayek, who believed in kind of evolution, and mechanism designers like you. The new dynamic fiscal policy. At time zero, we're going to write down and get the optimal thing. Hayek said it never works. It never works in practice. Why? He says these rules kind of evolve slowly. And now, if you kind of look at the old-time religion rules that the U.S. operated under, like say in the 19th century, they operated under those rules because they had evolved in England, and they were balanced budgets. They were the gold standard. They were, guys like Narayana say they can beat those rules, and they're probably true. Guys like Keynes and Narayana, they say beat them, but they evolved, and they worked for a long time. And they were in the heads of policymakers. And I'm kind of saying this tradition, the rules that have worked in the past are kind of in tradition. It's almost like religion or language. Mm-hmm. So it's a long answer. I don't know. So because this war between the designers and the evolvers, that goes way back. And if you want to see a beautiful wrestling with that, read Badgett. Badgett talks about this, and he has this chapter saying the British monetary system is totally crazy. And then would I recommend that you try to go to an optimal? He said, no way, because of tradition and because of credit and character. Anyway, but that's a non-answer to your question.
Probably, but but I think as a policymaker, I understand that this is not an optimal rule. But I think main reason when I talk to my colleagues at the IMF and policymaking world, they value still this fiscal rule because it can be some tool, method to prevent a huge mistake. So in some sense, as a kind of safeguard.
Okay, yeah. But so in my lifetime.
Yeah.
Okay, when I'm a kid. The only reason to keep an old guy like me around is memory, and there's some of the things that you remember are kind of useful. Uh-huh. So when I was a kid, the Democrats and the Republicans, they all believed you needed a balanced budget. Uh-huh. They both believed, they didn't question it. And they tinkered about whether, should you raise taxes, to do it, but they agreed on that. And now, there's all of these guys there say, because R is less than G, present values can be infinite, and it's an opportunity. And I'm horrified. There's nobody in my country, there's no party that says balanced budgets in any sense are good. Or no, we don't. And that's true on both wings, both parties. So that's, it's what's in people's heads.
Right.
So anyway.
I think that is music to my mind. And actually, I think I'm really concerned that for a country like us, the idea that we can continue to rely on the fiscal resources without thinking about where it comes is actually one of the concerns that we have. But by the way, I think you mentioned comments about your wife, but my experience say that controlling wife and son is much harder than controlling inflation, so just ignore it. Anyway, so...
No. If Carolyn were here, she'd say, controlling Tom's a snap.
I see. Okay, so and let's go back to your model again, Professor KOCHERLAKOTA, that you mentioned that monetary policy tightening can aggravate income distribution, even though you skipped that part. But do you think that monetary policy should consider income inequality when you make a policy? Or what do you think?
I think So I'm a big proponent of good governance in monetary policy. And I think there's this temptation among economists to think economists get to make monetary policy, and economists are good people, politicians not so much, and so economists should be allowed to be should be in charge of making up the rules for monetary policy. And I'm very opposed to this myself. I'm a big fan of the goals for monetary policy coming from the democratic institutions. So if you go to and I think this is true in this country as well, where I think the goals are laid out by the elected officials for the central bank, and then you make judgments of how you, and then you're judged and assessed, are you achieving those objectives or not? So in Canada, for example, the Bank of Canada makes an agreement with the Ministry of Finance of what their objectives are. Right now, they're supposed to be targeting 2% inflation. In the Bank of England's case, they have a target as well of 2% inflation, but also financial stability considerations. Now, the U.S. is completely messed up on this dimension. The Fed routinely makes up its own objectives. There's a high-level objectives, two high-level objectives of promoting price stability and max employment. But we all, as economists, recognize that this doesn't mean anything. And so the Fed has filled us in with 2% inflation and trying to keep unemployment low. They changed in 2020, they changed what this meant materially. And it was motivated by worrying more about income inequality. Now, and maybe this is a good thing to be worrying about from a monetary policy point of view, but I think if you're told to target inflation, you should target inflation and not worry about income inequality. If you're told to target inflation but worry about how you worry as well about income inequality by whoever the elected officials are, that's your job at that point. As unelected officials, you should not be allowed to just make up whatever your goals are for yourself. It has to come from the people, and that the elected officials are the channel through which that runs.
Okay, I think this is outside of your talk today, but I am just tempted to ask this question since you are the member of the FOMC. So what do you recommend the FOMC do in June meeting? This is very important for us.
Well, you know, my history in the FOMC when I was on the FOMC was one of dissent, which means dissenting from the FOMC is a big way of saying they didn't listen to what I said then. And so, so you shouldn't expect what I'm going to say.
Yeah, but you can comment.
You should not expect, but I am now perfectly free to comment. I really think the Fed should raise rates at this time. I think the track of inflation, despite what I made these academic points about relying more on fiscal policy, I think that's still true. But it really goes back to some of the things that Tom was saying, that if the Fed wants to convince people that it's trying to follow trying to bring inflation back down to 2%, this is not a time to say, to wait, I think. And so I really think the right question right now is 25 or 50.
Okay.
It's not 0 or 25. And I think a policy of waiting right now it doesn't, we all know 0 or 25 doesn't matter. It's all about the signal it sends about your intentions and what you care about. If the Fed does not raise rates now, they're signaling, we're very concerned about the financial sector. We're very concerned about what's going on with these regional banks in the United States, which are small potatoes. And that's what's dominating our thinking. And so I really think the conversation is in the wrong place. It should be about 25 or 50, not about 0 or 25.
Professor Sargent, do you agree?
So let me just mention, I don't know. Yes, I'd go up 100. So here's one thing to think about.
So this is the right kind of conversation.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay. You're ambiguous about what I think. 100. You didn't hear me. 125.
Oh.
Okay. So one thing is, so you could read about, Milton Friedman used to, he taught us in his presidential address and earlier, and he thought hard about what's the line between monetary and fiscal policy, and drawing severe lines. if you read Bernanke's 21st Century Monetary Policy, it's all about changing that line in big ways. So one thing is and there are things that he talks about pretty proudly, saying that various tools that weren't there in the 20th century, we now have them. You know, so two tools he talks about a lot. Okay, one is lender of last resort. Well, we had that before, but lots of things that you didn't know were banks just because they had bank on it. A bank is much more, a diamond divvy bank is anything that takes term structure risk. And we've expanded what a bank is. And then, in case you didn't get the message that, we have another tool called buyer of last resort. And now, we buy assets that in the 20th century we were told never to touch. Okay, so you kind of think about that, and that's what they used to talk about in the old days, is lame duck socialism. You go look it up. But it's about you're nationalizing lots of activities that used to be private activities that we trusted. You know, starting in the 19th century, clearinghouse, well, there were bank clearinghouses. They had their own rules. They had strict rules. Who was a member? You know, so lots of activities have been nationalized. So that book is about, and there's reasons for it. The underlying, you could say, Bernanke's a fine man and a great economist, you know, and a patriot. You can ask why does he think these things are a good thing? Well, where's Congress? You know, our Congress our Constitution has kind of gradually changed that lots of things that Congress is responsible for, they either they don't do or they delegated. And so there's a creeping institutional change that's going on, and it's you know things that I've learned from various people here, like Charlie Kahn, you know, and his people who aren't here, Will Roberts, about the alternatives that we had for these institutions. What's the line between private and public, and it's about risk bearing. Who's going to bear the risks? You know, who should bear risks? And
Sure.
Anyway.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, may I add something? I think these are really important points that Tom is making, and I'm maybe less concerned about the creep on the economic side. You know, we learn about problems that can occur in economies, and we learn about ways to respond to that. But I'm very concerned about the fact that Congress has essentially abrogated these choices to unelected officials, to the Bernankes and the Powells of the world, as opposed to Congress itself making the decision. And this was very clear in the response to COVID in 2020, where the Fed got involved in a bunch of novel market interventions that are really fiscal policy,
Yeah.
as Tom is saying. And the inappropriateness is not that maybe these are the right fiscal policy interventions. That could be right. But you don't want some unelected official, Jerome Powell, being the one to make the call on this.
Let me scare you. News headline: President fires Powell and appoints Sargent. You don't want some guy. You could have some person that's not as,
I think it's the right time for me to stop the two speakers to talk about these sensitive issues. But if we go back to these monetary policy questions, I fully understand that monetary policy is done from domestic objectives. So I think I think your advice maybe makes sense given the inflation statistic at this moment in the United States. But from a central banker's point of view outside the United States, the spillovers from U.S. monetary policy is quite significant. So what I mean is that we do not mean that the Fed has to consider the non-U.S. countries when they make a decision. But on the other hand, transparent and foreseeable communication is very important. So given that they signal already pause or small increase, if Fed decide 1%, I'm sure that that will cause a huge global spillovers that cannot be ignored. But anyway, so I understand your point.
Jeremy Stein has great papers on this. I think the Fed gets itself into a box by constantly communicating about interest rates too much. Okay. And it's really should be about, everything should be about goals and not about what you're doing with interest rates. It should be, what do we have to do to get back that down to 2%? Everything should be about that. And it's just not enough of the conversations like that.
Okay, so given this sensitivity, let me move on and to my last question to Professor Sargent. Unfortunately, I think the Professor Robert Lucas, who is your colleague in many literature, has passed away a couple of weeks ago. So for the memory of Professor Lucas and your joint work in pioneering rational expectation theory overall, could you share some episode or lessons that you remember so we can share?
So I'm the type of person that either, lots of times I feel like crying, and the way I cover it up is I make jokes and I laugh. But right now, I'm still with Bob Lucas and what he gave to us and me personally. I'm still crying, so and I don't feel like laughing, so I'm just not going to answer.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So it's quite sad for us to lose the big giant in economics. Anyways, we are in Seoul, in Asia. Punctuality is a very important merit. So now we run out of our time. So I'm very sorry that I cannot solicit the questions from the floor, but we will have a lunch and many other sessions so you can talk with our two great speakers. And for the media, because media is here, I want to emphasize that so far you have heard is views from the freshwater schools. So I want to make clear that there can be many different views. So with that, I think I am very grateful for our both speakers share time to come to Seoul to give us good inputs and good knowledge. So let's give a big applause for them. Thank you.
I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Governor Yee, Professor KOCHERLAKOTA, and Professor Sargent for preparations and efforts for policy dialogue. This concludes the opening session of the 2023 Bank of Korea International Conference. And now we're going to take a short coffee break and resume the conference at 10:40. We have prepared some snacks and beverages for our dear participants, and they're available in the lobby. Please help yourself.